Dr. Dorsey, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Rena. Delighted to be with you.
Many people know somebody that has had a brain disease, like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. And if you ask a doctor, most likely they'll say that there's nothing that we can do about these diseases. But Dr. Dorsey, you say that these diseases, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, are man-made and entirely preventable if we avoid certain toxins and certain foods.
It's really common. For Alzheimer's disease, 1 in 3 of us who live to 85 will develop Alzheimer's disease. Said another way, if you and your spouse or partner aspire to live to 85, there's a more than 50% chance that at least one of you will have Alzheimer's disease. Parkinson's disease is the world's fastest growing brain disease. Today in the United States alone, 200 people will be diagnosed with it, and another 100 people will die with it. And in general, brain diseases are now the world's leading source of disability, more than cancer, more than heart disease, more than infectious disease. And brain disease is also the world's second leading cause of death.
So why is this happening?
I think for many of these diseases, especially Parkinson's, but also diseases like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and Alzheimer's, even autism and intellectual disabilities, I think chemicals in our environment, especially in our food, water, and air, are fueling the rise of these diseases, including Parkinson's disease. Many of these diseases are new. They've only been recently described in the last 100 or 200 years. When they were initially described, they were really rare, and now they're growing rapidly and destroying lives, families, and crippling society. There is nothing natural about developing Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. You put a laboratory mouse in the lab for years, they don't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. Generally speaking, they don't spontaneously develop Alzheimer's disease. These diseases are not, by and large, for some, there are genetic components to some of these diseases, but by and large, these are not natural consequences of aging. No more than smoking, no more than lung cancer is a natural consequence of aging. If you don't smoke cigarettes, you're very unlikely to develop lung cancer. If you don't get exposed to these chemicals, you're really unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease. If you're not exposed to air pollution, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is dramatically reduced. Now, these diseases have genetic components to them. About 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history of the disease. Said another way, 85% don't. And about 15% of people have an identifiable genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease. But only 1% of individuals with Parkinson's disease have Parkinson's disease due to a purely genetic cause. For the vast majority of people who have a genetic risk factor, the majority of those people with that genetic risk factor will never go on to develop Parkinson's disease. There have to be other factors that cause people, even with genetic causes, to go on to develop the disease. Well, I'm a Parkinson's specialist, so almost everyone that I see has Parkinson's disease, and I think for almost all of these individuals, Parkinson's is preventable. I'm a neurologist, so I go around looking for Parkinson's disease, when I'm in the airport, when I'm walking or biking. And when I see someone with Parkinson's disease, I get pissed off because I think it's preventable. And I know the suffering that people are going to encounter in the future. I know the suffering that their friends and families are going to experience. And I think that for the vast majority of people, this is entirely preventable. And there's no reason that people need to have suffering. Suffering is part of the human condition, but needless preventable suffering should be prevented. Many of my colleagues are much more skeptical about the environmental causes. And quite frankly, I was too. About 6 years ago, I had the gift of a sabbatical as an academic. And I read the work of my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who's not only a Parkinson's specialist like me, but also an epidemiologist, has a PhD in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley. And I read her work for the last 40 years, and she's been politely and quietly and kindly telling us that Parkinson's disease is due to environmental causes. 25 years ago, she did a landmark study looking at rates of Parkinson's disease among identical twins and fraternal twins. And if something has a really high genetic component, identical twins are going to have a really high concordance rate. They're both likely to carry the disease, whereas fraternal twins who don't share the same genome are going to have be less likely to have it. She found that there was no difference between identical twins and fraternal twins in their likelihood of both carrying the disease, suggesting that for the vast majority of individuals with Parkinson's disease, genetics is only a small contributing factor and environmental causes are the principal causes of the disease. And she told us this 25 years ago. toxicants in our environment, food, water, and air, especially certain pesticides, a pesticide called paraquat, certain dry cleaning chemicals, if you can believe, dry cleaning chemicals, including a chemical called trichloroethylene and another one called perchloroethylene, and air pollution, I think, are the three major environmental risk factors for Parkinson's in the United States and likely around the world. There are many different parts of the brain, and neurologists like me tend to look at it from an anatomical structure, and that different parts of the brain control different parts. So when you're talking to me, I'm hearing and understanding what you're saying, but in an area part of the brain called Wernicke's, which is on the left part of my brain. When that information is then conveyed to a part of my brain where it generates speech called Broca's area. And so there's a loop that's responsible for language. And just like there's a loop responsible for language, there's a loop responsible for vision. So when I see you, it gets processed, goes through my retina, and then back to the part of my brain that processes it, and eventually back to the occipital lobe. And there's a part of our brain that's responsible for movement. And there's a part of our brain that's responsible for memory. And in people with Parkinson's disease, is that circuit that's responsible for one of the circuits that's responsible for movement. There are multiple. One of the circuits that's responsible for movement is damaged. In Alzheimer's disease, one of the circuits that's responsible for memory is damaged. Now, we don't know why a chemical like air pollution, for example, is linked to both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And we don't know, at least I don't know, why some people who are exposed to that chemical get to air pollution develop problems with memory and some develop problems with movement. But the circuits that are impacted lead to what diseases are manifest. Individuals with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, when you look at their brains under the microscope or after they die, you see high levels of iron. And your brain is really, really, really selective in terms of what it lets in and what it lets out. And it's not terribly keen to bring in heavy metals into the brain because many of these heavy metals can be toxic to brain cells. And it's not really clear how the iron got there. Some people have looked at nutrition, but largely they found that people who have a high iron diet are more likely to have iron in the brain, because I think the brain's really good at protecting itself from excess dietary intake of different chemicals. But the nose, I think, is the front door of the brain, and the nose bypasses the normal blood-brain barrier that protects the brain, and I think it's exploiting it. And so when you see air pollution, you can actually see air pollution like in Los Angeles. You see a haze, and that haze is made up of little pieces of dirt and soot. It's called particulate matter. Hitchhiking on the pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals like lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, and platinum from catalytic converters. So I think, don't know, but I think that iron is hitchhiking on these little tiny pieces of dirt and soot, are being inhaled, going through our nerve responsible for our smell, and going back to the smell center of our brain, and then spreading to other parts of the brain. I think that's how iron is entering our brain. And we increasingly know that from studies that high levels of air pollution increases your risk for Parkinson's disease and especially Alzheimer's. So we think Parkinson's disease is a brain disease and classically causes tremor, slowness of movement, problems with balance, and a shuffling gait. In 2003, a really smart German pathologist, Heiko Brack, postulated that Parkinson's disease, a brain disease, does not begin in the brain. He said, when you look at under the microscope, you first see the pathology of Parkinson's in the smell center, which we were discussing right above the nose, and we see it in the nerve cell body of the vagus nerve, which you might know connects the brainstem all the way down to the gut. And because of this, the latter finding, he thought that Parkinson's disease was due to neuro-invasion from an unspecified toxin. He thought maybe a virus. I think that's less likely, or only a small contributor, that enters in through the gut, then rides up or leads to pathology spreading up the vagus nerve into our brainstem, and then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement, those motor circuits that are controlled. And even now, 20 years later, my colleague, Dr. Borkhammer, and some of our friends and I just wrote a paper arguing that Parkinson's disease, most of Parkinson's disease begins in the nose through inhaled toxicants, inhaled air pollution, inhaled pesticides, inhaled dry cleaning chemicals, or less commonly for Parkinson's disease, is ingested through ingested pesticides, ingested dry cleaning chemicals that are in our water, or even probably less likely, small amounts of air pollution are actually swallowed as well. Poster child for this is a pesticide called paraquat. It's considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It was developed in the 1950s. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so toxic that it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. The EPA's own website says that one sip can kill. Over 50 countries, including China, have banned it, but the United States has not. In fact, use of paraquat in the United States has doubled in the last 5 years. It's sprayed in virtually every state in the country. It's sprayed on vineyards 30 minutes from where I live in Rochester, New York. I'm here in Colorado today. I'm sure it's being sprayed here in Colorado, and it's sprayed in the Central Valley of California. Dr. Tanner, the neurologist and epidemiologist that I mentioned earlier, over a decade ago showed that farmers who were exposed to paraquat had a 150% increased risk of developing the disease. Researchers, including one of my colleagues at the University of Rochester, 25 years ago demonstrated that when you feed paraquat to the laboratory animals, they develop the clinical and pathological features of the disease. If you don't believe any of that, an expose done by a really great journalist, Carrie Gillum, for The Guardian, looked at legal documents from the company who manufactures paraquat. They're being sued by some farmers who are asserting that their Parkinson's disease was likely caused by this pesticide paraquat. It turned out that the company's own research, according to The Guardian, and then demonstrated that that 3 different mammals, mice, rats, and rabbits, when exposed to high doses of paraquat, developed features of Parkinson's disease. In the 1960s, they did that, before I was born. So the company manufacturing paraquat has known for over 50 years that their product produces the features of Parkinson's disease when fed to mammals. Dr. Tanner and her colleagues, Dr. Beata Ritz, a researcher at UCLA, and her colleagues have demonstrated that people who drink well water, about 40 million Americans get their water not from city water, which is regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, but from private wells on their own property. These wells are often relatively shallow. They tend to be in rural areas where farming is conducted nearby, and pesticides can be washed off farms and sink into the ground and contaminate groundwater from which the wells derive their water. And so people who drink well water have about a 75% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease, because they are likely, in some cases, develop drinking water that's contaminated with pesticides, and they don't even know it because their well water is infrequently tested, often only when you buy or sell your home. And even then, when it's tested, it's usually tested for bacteria because people worry about infectious diseases, and often not even tested for pesticides. Tap water that most of us get is coming from a municipality or a city, and that's been regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and therefore it's regularly tested. So usually that water from a tap would not have high levels of pesticides. And you can imagine if you're in an urban environment, pesticides would likely not be the predominant contamination. That said, I still put a carbon filter, from Pure or Brita, from your grocery store on my tap at home, so that the water I drink, even though it should be safe, I added another layer of protection. And these carbon filters, which are relatively inexpensive, are actually can be quite effective at decreasing exposure to pesticides and other chemicals in your water that might be contributing to brain diseases or cancer or a wide range of medical conditions.